Of the mystical creatures of medieval lore, it is often the dragons that get the main attention, with their own unique weapons built to counter them. Perhaps a little less discussed is the weirdly common medieval depiction of noble knights going to combat against snails. Previously recreated some weaponry from fantasy shows like Game of Thrones, so I thought I'd get ahead of the curve on this one before the next big budget fantasy series gets made.
The hour is late. You have no choice but to submit.
So let's see if it's possible to make the ultimate anti-snail weapon and try and cast a sword out of salt. So the real inspiration of this is a different video by Robinson Foundry that made the rounds showing their salt casting experiments. It's not something I've tried before, but I was curious to try it out. I've used salt and borax as a flux in a few different capacities, but it's not something I've really tried before, and I was curious to give it a shot. Some of my best performing videos have been my experiments with trying to cast swords out of less traditional materials, from old pennies, cast iron, to obsidian. I have a few more experiments planned, but thought it'd be a fun project to do on the side to continue the series of Will It Sword. So let's give it a shot and see if we can vanquish some meddlesome snails from our fiefdom. I wanted to have a purpose for the sword, so we'd have something to aim for and test how well it actually works, besides just being a decorative art project.
What is this for?
And Theo reminded me of this historic meme of knights fighting snails, a drawing frequently showing up in the margins of books from 1290 to 1310 at least 70 times in 29 different books. There's no clear explanation for why this became a popular drawing at the time, with many competing theories, like it represents a struggle between the upper and lower classes, the resurrection, or political commentary of the time. Salt is a classic weapon to be used against snails, because it dries them out and dehydrates them through osmosis. Snails are mostly made out of water and have a highly permeable skin, allowing salt to very quickly dry them out. And this isn't limited to just sodium chloride, pretty much any salt compound will work. First up, let's try a very basic open-face mold of a sword to get the hang of casting this different material. Salt is a very different material than anything else I've tried to cast. With a slightly higher melting point than aluminum, I was expecting it to behave similarly. Instead, it had none of the thick viscosity I was expecting, and is pretty much transparent. It's like pouring water. The end result is also strange to see in person. It does very much almost appear like a metal. Next, let's try a standard mold, as I've traditionally learned to use for sword casting. This should contain the molten salt better and get a full shape. Although the liquid is so thin and running, I'm worried that if there are any gaps in the mold, the whole thing could pour right out. Pouring this is a huge nightmare. The viscosity is so different from anything else I've done, and very much suffered from what is apparently called the teapot effect, where it dribbles down the side. Once pouring, everything was in flames and I couldn't see where the clear liquid was going. So I just dumped and prayed that at least some of it made it down. The challenge is always going to be the very brittleness of cast salt. It forms fairly solid pieces, but is easily fractured. So any way that can increase its rigidity is going to help us achieve our goal of a usable sword. Next, I'm curious to try it in a plaster sand mold. I've done similar methods with obsidian casting years before. Assuming that salt crystallizes in a very similar way to how glass anneals, I might be able to achieve a better result by slowly cooling the salt in a kiln. After making the plaster sand mold, I kiln dried it and then added in the salt. As it started to melt, I added in more salt. But once fully melted, pretty much all the salt disappeared, which leaves me a bit confuddled. It did not appear to leak out of the metal frame of the mold, and I couldn't find any pool of it underneath the plaster. My best guess is that because the molten salt is so runny, it managed to get absorbed into the plaster and sand mold itself. You know, I'm the kind of person who will rebuild an ancient invention from scratch before I'll call a doctor. But a few months ago, that caught up with me. I've been putting off a checkup, partly because I don't know where to start, and partly because calling around, waiting on hold, and trying to figure out which doctor even takes my insurance sounds miserable. Then one morning I woke up feeling awful. That's when I found today's sponsor, ZocDoc. ZocDoc is a free website where you can search and compare high quality, in-network doctors, choose the right one for your needs, and click to instantly book an appointment. And ZocDoc isn't just for one type of care. They have more than 100,000 providers across nearly every specialty, from primary care to dental health, eye care to urgent care to mental health, and more. It's the one-stop shop for your healthcare needs. No need to call the doctor's office and wait on hold either. ZocDoc lets you do everything online. When you found the doctor you need, you can see their actual appointment openings. Plus, ZocDoc helps you get appointments fast, typically within just 24 to 72 hours of booking. And you can even score same-day appointments. You can even read verified patient reviews and see real-time openings. So when you click to book, there's an actual time spot, not a we'll call you back situation. So if you've been putting off that appointment, stop waiting for the right time. Go to ZocDoc.com/HDME to find and instantly book a top-rated in-network doctor today. So next, I remade the mold with a smaller pan that I knew definitely would not leak. And then tried using a coating of sodium silicate to seal the plaster so hopefully the salt won't permeate it. Sodium silicate is used for sealing concrete, and I've used it previously for casting when you combine it with sand and it hardens with exposure to CO2. But when I preheated the mold, the sodium silicate ended up foaming up and separating. So I think I need to try something else. So now let's move on to trying a different salt, borax. Most of my experience with borax comes from glass experiments, including my obsidian sword casting experiments from before. But I don't think I've ever tried using just 100% borax, so this should be interesting. My expectation is something similar to glass. The interesting thing about using the borax is that it actually comes chemically bonded with water, so as you heat it up, it actually kind of foams up and boils off the water. Which is actually kind of similar to what happens with obsidian, which also has gas trapped inside of it and turns into a foam when you heat it. In contrast to the table salt, borax was surprisingly viscous, coming out a little bit closer to metal, and it ended up being so viscous it actually solidified before filling up much of the mold. What I wasn't expecting was for it to turn black, looking almost like asphalt or tar. I can only assume this is from the graphite crucible. I've run into this a lot with glass making, that once it's molten, it just really wants to absorb anything that it touches. So you generally need to use a non-reactive crucible like alumina or porcelain. So next I experimented with melting borax using one of these alumina crucibles. But unfortunately it ended up cracking and I lost a lot of the borax. But what I was able to pour was semi-transparent and white. Interestingly, even air cooling it, it managed to stay in one piece, although it had a lot of interior cracking inside of it. So next, applying what I learned so far, I made a new plaster sand mold. This time I used a compound called boron nitride, which is a glass release, to help form a less permeable barrier. After heating the mold, I then cast borax into one half, and then I was going to attempt to do salt in the other half, but the molten salt cooled a little too much to be pourable. Then I left it in a kiln to slowly anneal, and hopefully not crack. Meanwhile, I still wanted to attempt a full-size sword cast, so was curious to try a 50-50 mix of salt and borax. This wound up being thicker, more like the borax, but was still a pain to pour accurately. The result was surprisingly solid, but did not fill the full blade shape very well. So next attempted with the full blade cast. It's still very runny at this point, and ended up losing a lot pouring out of the edge of it. But after opening it up and carefully exhuming it, we actually managed to get a full intact sword. But for a third option, I wanted to take one more lesson from obsidian. While I managed to eventually cast an obsidian sword, it was fragile and pretty impractical. For actual combat use, inspiration from weapons like the Makwaital might point in a better solution, where pieces of the sharp glass are glued into a wood frame, providing a more durable, yet sharp weapon. So we cast some saw blades and glued them into a wooden sword frame. Now let's test them out on our snail stand-in. So I think this has been kind of a fun experiment to mess around with and see what kind of results we can get with these different materials. I think this is probably kind of the best results we're gonna get with kind of our goal in mind, an actual solid sword. And we have 3 results of 3 potential possibilities of something working. So we have the borax. It ended up cracking before I fully annealed it, but I was able to get the temperature up hot enough to get it to kind of fuse together. Thin parts where it's fused, so there's a possibility it might break. And then I tried sharpening it and had decent success to get at least kind of a sharp edge, but it's not really hard material. And also just in the time since I left it annealing to now, it's already starting to react with the air. When it was first done, it was basically a clear glass. Since then, it's started reacting and absorbing water and turning into kind of a softer soap-like consistency. So it's not quite as hard as it was before. Maybe a little bit easier to dissolve once you get into the snail. I'm not sure. Then we have the full sword cast with borax salt mixture. And this came out surprisingly good. It does have a lot of flaws in it. There are a few small cracks kind of glued together to prevent it from falling apart, and a few voids here and there. So it's pretty fragile. I took some of the initial tests to see if I could grind an edge on it. You kind of could, but it's pretty crumbly and pretty brittle. I don't know how well you could actually swing it. Got a few weak points, but probably do some damage. And then we have the shards glued into a board technique. The flakes that we cast ended up breaking up quite a bit. So you have a lot of small chunks, and they are pretty fragile. They're definitely a lot more fragile than obsidian. So unclear exactly how many whacks this will be able to do, but hopefully you should be able to penetrate it. It's gonna be a very jagged weapon. I think thanks to the wood, it's gonna be the most rigid and less likely to just shatter on me. So now all it's left to do is to test it out on our hypothetical snails. And I made a little model of a snail, tried to make it out of ballistic gel, and had a little bit of issues. So it's falling apart a little bit, but I think it'll still work for our test. None of these are really gonna work super great against like an actual knight or human. I think you're gonna have them shattering pretty quickly, but in the condition of a snail against something that's very soft, nothing really hard to actually hit, I think we stand a chance of these actually working fairly well, hopefully before they break. So let's see if in this hypothetical situation, we can get something that actually kills. Just gonna try and stab it. We can pierce it. Actually pretty rigid. That's a lot stronger than I thought, actually. That could actually do some damage. All right. Well, that cuts. That guy's did not even break. I am very impressed. And we broke. Sword is broken. Not too impressive. Fairly rigid. Surprisingly dull, though. I still pierced it though. I don't know. Yeah, it broke. So on that one. Kind of bounces off. So yeah, we can definitely saw. There. I think our best bet is to saw through the snail with this guy. Actually held up better than I expected. I expected this thing to shatter the first hit, so definitely lost a few. But with a soft target, I'd say actually pretty good. To answer the question, yes, you can cast a salt sword and actually get a halfway decent result. Big sword ended up snapping in half, as kind of expected. It had some weak points there, but actually managed to hold up fairly well, I would say. Better than I expected. Flaked edges are not quite as sharp as I thought. None of them were really that sharp. It's hard to really put an edge on it, I'm finding, on any of these. They're all just pretty brittle. This one has a little bit of an edge and actually was able to stab the best with it. And I'm quite surprised how well it actually held up. This is surprisingly rigid. And I feel like a nice dagger like this, you stab it into the snail, it'll dissolve and poison them, basically. I think the borax is probably the best bet, I would say. But this guy did pretty good too. Did not shatter as much as I thought. I think it's actually a pretty good weapon. And the best part with this is after it breaks, you can just bludgeon them with a stick. And ultimately, that might be the best solution if you're faced with a snail, to just hit it with a stick. Because if you go back to some of the original drawings, sometimes they just use a stick. Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope this has been kind of a little fun little experiment. Hoping to do some of these shorter videos a little bit more on the side. Hoping to do some more sword experimenting with weird materials. So if you have any ideas for that you want me to explore, let me know. So hoping to do some like smaller projects like this to kind of fill in the gaps between larger videos that I'm working on now. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and thank you to all my supporters on Patreon. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and check out other content we have covering a wide variety of topics. Also, if you've enjoyed these series, consider supporting us on Patreon. We are largely a fan-funded channel and depend on the support of our viewers in order to keep our series going. Thanks for watching.